story of Upbuild began in a monastery. On our quest to understand ourselves more deeply, we recognize that it is our attachment to our egos, our identities, that gets in the way of being our true selves. This podcast will help you understand your ego. It will help you better understand your inner world, the motivations, insecurities, and emotions that affect your every action and relationship. Welcome to Upbuilding the Self. Hi everyone, this is Vipin, and I'm here with Michael and Prasada, and we're all really excited about the topic we're discussing today. At Upbuild, we focused a lot on understanding the ego, and thinking about identity is such a core part of the work we do because the ego is an identity. And that overarching identity is also made up of many mini identities or designations. And Michael, you had mentioned that you had this experience where you were digesting some of the content from James Clear's book, Atomic Habits, and it had you question how to reconcile the benefits of using identities to build habits, as he very clearly outlines in the book, with some of the costs that we talk about at Upbuild. So the three of us were having a very rich discussion on this topic, and we thought it would be beneficial for others as well. And so here we are. So Michael, could you start by taking us into your experience with James Clear's book, Atomic Habits, and the case he presents for why identities are good?
Thank you, Vipin. So this is an experience I had a couple of years ago. And I was listening to James Clear on a podcast talk about some of the work that he presents in his book, Atomic Habits, which for anyone who doesn't know, Atomic Habits has become essentially the habit Bible. And James Clear has become the guru of habit formation in the last few years. And one of the key things that he talks about is using identities to form habits. So he calls this identity-based habits. And the idea is that one of the most effective ways for us to stick to our habits is to actually take on the identity of someone who would have those habits in their life. And one of the ideas that resonated most strongly with me, not that I'm a smoker, but he gave the idea, the example of someone who is a smoker, who's offered a cigarette. And if this person was trying to quit, a common response might be, no, thank you, I'm trying to quit. But instead, he suggests the person say, no, thank you, I'm not a smoker. And the reason why this small, subtle difference is important is because if I say that I'm trying to quit, then my identity is as someone who is trying to quit, who is striving, but there would be naturally some difficulty in quitting, versus the identity of I'm a non-smoker. That's very clear. And in order for me to maintain that identity, I would then need to naturally reject any cigarette that's offered to me. So this was a really compelling case. And I was getting quite excited about using this in my life and thinking about the various identities that I might start taking on in order to create the habits that I would want to take. But then I started to think about the work that we do at Upbuild and how so much of our work is actually thinking about how identities get in the way of who we really are.
Great framing for the whole discussion. And I want to start by understanding, you said you were excited about all these identities that you could take on to use for your own benefit. So I want to hear about some of the ones that you have, and Prasada, you as well. But before you do that, one thing that was coming into my mind as you shared this example of being the non-smoker, what does that person do when the guy he takes a smoke break with every day is like, I know you're a smoker. Why are you telling me you're a non-smoker? How does that work in practice?
Yeah, I don't know. Of course, there are places where it might not work because of believability issues. But the idea that James Clear presents is that the more we reinforce the identities, the greater chance we have at actually developing the habits that would substantiate those identities.
And actually, my prompt was meant more as a joke, but as I was saying it, I realized that there's a really important answer in there, which we'll probably get to later in the discussion. Well, who am I surrounding myself with? So if I'm trying to actually change my identity to being a non-smoker, but I'm still hanging out with all my smoker friends who are then telling me, I know you're a smoker, it's going to be really hard to establish a new identity. But maybe we'll come more to that as we progress the discussion.
Well, that's a great point. It's actually another piece of the book where he talks about how in order to create the habits that we want to create, we need to get in a group where that habit is not only socially accepted, but it's actually encouraged.
Yeah, yeah. Would love to hear some examples from both of you from your own lives where having an identity has been helpful. So, Hari, maybe you could jump in here. What are some examples from your life where having an identity has been helpful? And Michael, when we come to you, thinking about, especially after hearing this podcast from James Clear, what new identities did you try to experiment with that have been helpful for you?
I find particularly that the idea of an identity for habit formation is best suited when it's geared towards negating something negative. And the reason for that is because then you're not building a positive identity of who I think I should be in this world, which is the ego. So that's where we get to a slippery slope, and we'll talk more about that. But to your question.
Wait, sorry, I want to interrupt you because this is very good. So two things that jumped out at me. First, it was very poignant to me that you said using identities for habit formation in particular versus for anything else that you might use identities for. And that seemed very intentional. So why did you emphasize for habit formation? Is it just because we're talking about atomic habits, or is there more to that?
No, thank you. It is very important. It's because we want to come closer and closer to who we are, to the self. And that means acting in a way that's in alignment. And that means the right habits. So we do have positive identities around positive habits that help us align more with the self. But that becomes a slippery slope because we start to then do the exact opposite. It's like we're pouring water on the fire as we're trying to let it be inflamed more and trying to fuel it. Because we're thinking, well, okay, I'm going to create a habit that's aligned with who I am. And then I'm going to, on top of that, create an identity that actually is not who I am, and it becomes circular. So with negating habits, it's just very straightforward. It's not that we never want to do the positive. It's just that that's the slippery slope. Whereas with the negation, it's very straightforward. So in my own life, I don't drink became an identity of mine. And that was a hard one at first because I was so accustomed to drinking as a social lubricant and as a part of a bigger identity. I'm a very sophisticated person. I was the person who tasted wine. They would give me the wine and I would know exactly how to swish it around, to sniff it first and then swish it around on the tongue and then to just nod. You don't say, oh, it's good. That's totally classless. No, you just nod. That means it was fine. And then you motion that the waiter can serve everybody else.
You're really taking us back into your auteur days here.
Yes, that's right.
I'm also already learning from this podcast as a result of it.
This is what we really want to teach.
I will never say it's good again.
This is really what we want to teach.
Oh, gosh of me. I feel
That's right. That's right. There's much more to be said about that. But so it was all to that to say it was particularly difficult to then go the other way. And I needed to really understand, you know what? I'm not a drinker. I don't do that. I don't drink. And even when all of my friends were surprised and like that's what we did together, I would always have a Stella Artois or a glass of wine or a sangria or something. And I had so many identities around that like I'm the one who gets the pitcher for the table. I'm the generous one. I'm the one who brings the fun for everybody else and takes care of everybody. So then like it requires another momentum in the other direction. No, actually, that's not who I am. I have to negate that identity that I've created, and I have to create another identity that flies in the face of it. I don't do that. That's not who I am. That has nothing to do with my real self.
So what allowed you to trade? I mean, these identities, not just of being a drinker, but being sophisticated, being the fun, being the one who gets things started.
Generous. I'm the generous one. I take care of everybody. I mean, like it's deep, deep, deep stuff that has nothing to do with drinking. That was just a proxy.
Right, right.
Yeah.
So what allows you to trade those identities for this sort of negative identity or an identity in which you're negating something? That doesn't sound very attractive.
Right. That's the whole challenge. You have to have a higher taste. There has to be a drive to something greater. And without that, it's weak. It's really weak. And you'll stumble and eventually revert to the mean, most likely. Or, you do it for some time. You're like, yeah, that was good. That was a good period of my life.
So just like being a non-smoker, you have to have a really strong resolve for what's important about this. And you decide it is, and then this becomes just almost a tactic to align yourself with that why.
Yeah, exactly. That means you have to know more about the self. How can you align with the self if you don't know the self? That means how can you create habits that are aligning with the self, that are positive in that sense, if you don't know that? So for me, I was studying the nature of the self. I understood the self is self-controlled and is not dependent on substances for fun and actually prefers crystal clarity and sobriety and doesn't need a lubricant to feel good about myself, to interact with people, and so many other things. That's just the tip of the iceberg, but that gives a sense. So when you understand what the self is and you get a glimpse and you understand some of the attributes and you lean into them, then it's like, oh yeah, well, why would I cover that?
Yeah. But even if you didn't have any understanding of the self, and and say you didn't desire to, but you had a very strong desire to stop drinking because it was wreaking havoc in your life, and you recognize that despite the positive associations you had, you could create a identity that negates the drinking.
Hypothetically, but then what about AA, right? Like AA actually says you need a different modality altogether.
So what could that modality be? Like, let's move out of drinking, for example. What does that mean to have a different modality? Like, what if I just want to be the type of person that doesn't procrastinate anymore? And so that's a new identity. Again, it's a negating something.
Yeah.
I'm not a procrastinator. So what's the new modality here?
Even without knowledge of the self, this is what James Clear is talking about. It's like you decide what identity you want, and then you align your habits with that identity. You become more and more of that identity, and then your habits in turn become more and more ingrained, and then it becomes natural at some point. And so we're actually discussing a little bit one step before that around which identities are good and which habits do I actually want to take on. But I think what he's offering us is a little bit less about how to make that decision. But once we've made the decision that we want to do something, what's an effective way to actually do that?
Mm-hmm. And calling ourselves that by that identity to have a tighter association, not with the habit alone, but with the identity of one who who has this habit?
Yeah, so he actually gives this example in the book of somebody who wants to become a runner, who wants to start running more. The desire is to start running more. And I forget exactly the circumstances of the example, but for some reason, the person is not either able or willing to run for a certain period of time in the beginning of this habit formation. So in lieu of that, what they do is they buy a bunch of running clothes, and every morning they get into those running clothes, including running sneakers, and then go outside. But they don't actually go for a run, at least in the beginning. And then they go back inside and take off all their clothes and get into normal clothes and go about their day. But just that act of buying the clothes, and now I'm a runner and I'm going outside for a run, it's starting to create the seeds of an identity that I am a runner. And eventually the habits are going to align with that identity.
I mean, the skeptic would listen to this and be like, does it really? Come on, you put on the clothes, you walk outside. Nah, I'm going to go back inside, change. And so I would let Michael tell us about some of the habits that you actually tried to take on, or identities that you try to take on after listening to this, in the last couple of years.
Yeah, well, I don't know if it was in direct reaction to listening to this, but this has been something that has become more and more clear to me over the years. And so one of the things that I do is I write this annual newsletter that I send out to my whole network of people that I know. And in it, I talk about sometimes funky things that I am trying and taking on. Ice baths have become a much bigger part of my life in the last couple of years. And I noticed that when I wrote I think it was the 2 years ago newsletter where I was very, very strong and convicted in the importance of taking ice baths. And I sent it out and I talked about how recently I've been doing it every day, which was true. There was about a 3-month period up leading into when I wrote that newsletter that I had been doing it every day. And when I wrote that and then sent it out, I felt this like, okay, this is my identity. And now 700 people know that this is my identity. And the consistency with I've been taking ice baths as a result of taking on that identity has been so much stronger just because I put it out into the world.
Yeah. This is another thing about habits. Making some kind of public declaration sort of holds you accountable.
Yes, but it's not that anyone could find out. Like, there's no way for people. So I wasn't on stage being judged.
But it's your own personal integrity.
Yeah,
it's your own personal integrity. It's you looking at yourself. I put this out there. Now I better live up to it.
Yeah, but I never said that. I never made a commitment about what I would do. But it was my personal integrity around the identity of I'm an ice bath guy, or I'm an ice bath guru, and we can talk about how I start to fall off a cliff here with the Upbuild way of looking at identities with this one.
Coming, that's coming. But also now I'm finally recognizing I'm very enlightened now that your annual email is actually, the whole purpose of it is for you to declare all of your new identities that you need to have stuck. So I will read it.
There's a lot of different motivations that I can.
That's another podcast.
You can psychoanalyze me in another time. Yeah.
So it seems clear that you want to change something, and an effective way to do that is to see yourself as the type of person who does the thing or does not do the thing that you're trying to change. And you start to sort of embody it more, own it more. And we also talked a little bit about surrounding yourself with people who have similar habits and goals. What's the case for this holding us back? And Hari, you alluded to this by saying it's crystal clear when it comes to a habit that I'm trying to negate something. But what's the slippery slope here that you both are kind of alluding to?
Before that, I also want to, Hari, I want you to answer this first, but want to press on that idea that it's crystal clear when we're trying to negate something.
Yes,
because I think there's a lot that can come out from that. I was thinking about the not drinking example, and I know a lot of people who have sort of gotten on their high, and I've done this too, so I don't need to look so far, who've gotten on their high horse around, I'm not a drinker. Look at me. And yeah, that the habit itself might be actually very helpful. But now I build a whole identity around that, me not doing something. Okay. And then that starts to take me away from my best self.
But that becomes the positive identity. And then there are more positive identities associated with that. And I'm an upright, an upstanding person. All of that is tightly tied. And this is why it goes back to the point about your why. And can you really get disentangled from the ego and go towards the self with positive habits that align with the self if you don't know anything about the self? It's difficult to do that. You can't really, because you're always going to be forming another identity around that. Unless my approach for not drinking is because I want to align with myself for the reasons that I mentioned. I mean, that is alone a reason, but with the description of the self, understanding that this is why the self does not drink, it's very difficult to not create all kinds of subsidiary identities.
And being spiritual is an identity that people really get trapped in. They see themselves as enlightened or more enlightened than everyone else, and that becomes who they think they should be.
Exactly.
So let's take the relatively innocuous example of being a runner. Like, I'm trying to build a habit. So I think of myself as a runner. I buy the clothes. I start going out every morning. And before you know it, I'm starting to run. Where does this start to be something I should approach with caution? Because that seems also relatively straightforward and positive.
From the beginning.
You lost me there.
You should approach this with caution from the beginning, because you should know the ego is always at work. And what's the ego's motive here? Oh, well, then I'll be in shape, and then I'll be admired. And then I can think I'm sexy. And then, or like I'm really healthy.
Wow. I didn't even notice that all those things were there. I just want to run.
Yeah, no.
As soon as you said it, I'm like, yeah, of course. All of that's part. Why do I want to be a runner in the first place? Well, to be healthy. To
be healthy, so that then I can have a long-lasting life of enjoyment, and I can show people that, like, I've got it together. I'm really healthy. I'm enjoying. Things are good.
All right, you are turning all positive intentions and twisting them into ego-driven negativity.
The ego is doing it. I'm just pointing it out.
I'm trying to represent the layman here, in thinking about how one might react. And when, Hari, you're saying this, we just take certain things as unequivocally good. Like, I should enjoy my life and I should live as long as possible. Those are not really questioned. When we have those motivations, those are not questioned at all in terms of the impurity that might be there in those.
Yep.
Yeah, so please enlighten us about the impurity. I mean, you're saying maybe, well, let's take one, like wanting to live a healthy life, a long, healthy life.
Yeah. Well, that's for what purpose? So that I can enjoy myself. And the ego is defined by I am the controller and I'm the enjoyer. So I will control so that I can enjoy. I will make sure that I am healthy and fit to have as much enjoyment as possible in this world, and identified with my mind and body and my center of existence all around me.
Okay, so I'm going to flip this to the complete opposite side then. Based on what you're saying, all of it, you said be cautious from the beginning, and all the ego is present here always. So then aren't all of these really tinged and quite, like, why would you do this?
It all depends on your motivation. That's the whole thing. If your motivation is to understand the ego and let go of it, and understand the self and inhabit it, then whatever you do, you can't go wrong. And even if you make missteps, then you're going to be going in the right direction. You're going to learn from those missteps. But if your motivation has nothing to do with understanding who we are and who we're not, then naturally you're just shooting in the dark. And of course, you're going to be developing more ego identities. It can't be any other way.
Yeah. You're trading one entanglement for
Yeah,
another, basically.
exactly. And one might give you a better quality of life and it might be more satisfying for some time, but that's fine. But what are we really after? Is that going to fulfill us?
Can we make this very specific and concrete? Let's take some examples of what we're trading one entanglement for the other. I mean, we talked about this spirituality, drinking, running, but like, what are other examples of something you think is just purely positive, but what are we not seeing about the entanglement?
Along the same lines, if I take vegetarianism, so I became a vegetarian because I wanted to become a yogi. And that's one of the principles, ahimsa in yoga, is nonviolence, respecting the life of all living beings. And so you honor them and you don't commit that violence. It's not needed. So I became a vegetarian for that purpose, to align with the self. Now, I could have become, well, actually, I became a vegetarian first before that, but then I added many more understandings and layers to that and different habits around vegetarianism for that purpose. But when I first began, I was thinking like, I'm a really good person. People should be more like me, right? And so what's interesting is I started for moral reasons as a vegetarian, and then I increased my habit for spiritual reasons. And that changed the quality of it, because then aligning with the self or the soul, if you will, the motivation is totally different and the effect on oneself and other people is totally different. Then you can't really be on your high horse. Of course, plenty of spiritual people are not looking at their own egos, and that's the problem, but that's not spiritual.
So what you said about people should be like me, to me, that's such a good warning sign. When that happens, you know you've gone from sort of
Moral
orange
to moral
level
superiority.
yeah, you've gone from orange level alert to red level alert, because that's where the ego has really kicked in.
That's great, but the thing is, it's so subtle, because from wanting to do the right thing and doing the right thing and wishing other people would do the right thing, it's very different, right? Like if I think people should not be killing each other for the spoils of war, and I'm not doing that, so people should not do that also. That's very different from like, people should be like me. Setting an example has to be done so delicately, because we don't want to throw out that I want to be an example for other people. At Upbuild, we want to be examples. We want to live an exemplary life. We want to show that it's possible to inhabit the self in full and to get closer and closer, and give people that opportunity. Teaching by example. That's the most powerful thing we can do, is teach by example. So we're not throwing that away. But as soon as it's look at me, the quality changes, the consciousness changes. It's subtle.
But how do you avoid that? I mean, like, even if the example I gave about procrastination. So I can imagine myself wanting to change that habit and then having the identity of I'm not someone who procrastinates, and then seeing the impact of that and being proud of how I've been on my like not waiting, getting ahead of things. And then before I know it, somebody else on the team is procrastinating and I'm thinking, why can't you be more like me? I mean, how do you avoid that from happening?
It's a great question. You just don't claim that it's your own doing. You don't claim that, like, I conquered this, I'm so great. That's the ego. And that's actually coming from insecurity. It's not as glamorous as it seems. It's like, yeah, I can. In other words, I'm crushing the voice of the inner critic that is always saying, I can't. And I'm saying, see, I can. And that's why I'm celebrating. I wouldn't have to be so like, yes, if I thought that I could do it from the beginning. That's just a compensation. So when I recognize I don't have to play this inner critic game, I don't have to prove myself to myself, and I don't have to be proud of I did it. I can recognize that myself is a certain way, and I just want to align with that. And yes, that's hard work. And yes, I need help. I need guidance. I need people who are inhabiting the self more than I am, or who are striving to inhabit the self as much as possible. And then I think it's all by their grace, and it's by the fact that I'm trying to be sincere, and I can celebrate my sincerity. I can celebrate that I mean this, that I'm trying my best. And I can celebrate that it was hard work to get here. And I'm so grateful I got there. But I'm not like, yeah, see, pat myself on the back. I did it. Just so you know, I did
it. Well, what I'm taking away is that you're telling me that I have no reason to be proud of many things that I feel proud about. And I feel like it's a little bit of a takedown, and I'm appreciating it. Okay. Okay.
It also depends where we're coming from. And I mean, this is consistent with what Hari has shared. When we're talking about what we did to other people and we're disguising it as for their benefit, but it's really for validation, for the identity that we want to see ourselves as, and we want the other to see us as, that's where we get into trouble. And that's where we go away from ourselves. Like with procrastination, for example, there are various systems that people use to overcome procrastination. I've used various systems myself, or systems to become more productive, something like the inbox zero system. And it's been really helpful for me. It works really well. It helps me organize my life. I think I can get more stuff done. And Hari, I also think that there are some things about it that help me move closer to the self, because it creates some peace within me. And so there are real benefits. And what I notice, what happens is I speak about it in a way where it's like, this is such a great system. I've been able to master it. And you can too, if you're just a little bit more like me. And of course, those words are not said explicitly, but that's implied. And so it's coming from a place of ego rather than what you said of, first of all, I'm just so grateful that this has been given to me and that I have the circumstances that are fortunate enough to be able to do it. And being so oriented towards the other person and wanting them to benefit, that I share it in a way where it's fully in service of them rather than in service of the validation that I know that I'll get when I tell them about this.
That's beautifully put. Yeah.
Yeah. I was going to say that why is that service? Like I've gained so much from this, and you can too. Like, let me help you do. I mean, the whole self-help industry is basically that. Like,
yes. Exactly.
I've done this and I'm offering this to you, and you can do it too.
The thing is, look, we're not trying not to celebrate new habits. We're trying to celebrate them from a completely different place, from a place that's very foreign to us because we live in the ego land.
Yeah. And I think there's a lot of benefit. There are benefits with doing it from the ego, right? Like people do change. People do meditate more. People do get more productive and efficient when these things are shared. But what we're often not paying attention to is the cost. We're suffering those costs, but we're just not so aware of them.
And also, what does it ultimately amount to, right? What is the existential fulfillment here?
That's great.
Can you expand on that? What does it amount to? What you're saying, if it's coming from the ego, then what does it really amount to?
It's a house of cards. The ego is a phantom. It's a non-entity. It's a sense of self that simply isn't. So when you feed that, you're not doing any good for anybody. Now, you may relatively for some time period feel like, ooh, my life feels nice now. But your heart does not get filled by that. And eventually we're going to leave these minds and bodies and everybody else behind. And that's an existential issue. a deep, deep existential issue. So am I feeding the real self? Am I actually nourishing the person that I am? Or am I settling for all of these kind of like nice things that I can do in this life, which ultimately don't satisfy me at all, but leave me restless and wanting more and more and more. And I can't actually ever be satisfied.
One of the things that I'm also just thinking about in this moment and taking away is I give the example of our kids. We have now they're almost 10, but they've been vegetarian their whole lives. And when they were toddlers at a very young age, I found it very curious that they had this identity that they were vegetarian well before I thought I would understand them to have an identity like that, where they would be in a setting and they would say, "Oh, we don't eat that because we're vegetarian," even though I didn't think that that's what we had communicated to them. And it struck me that we have so many identities right from the earliest age, right from birth, as we start to interact with people and they have an experience of us and we have an experience of them, and just identities, these mini identities start to form. And so on one hand, what I'm taking away is there is an opportunity to switch out a lot of these mini identities. And that's what James Clear is really talking about, like, oh, I have an identity. I mean, this comes later, hopefully, but I'm a smoker and I want to switch that out to having an identity of a non-smoker. Or I'm an identity of like, I don't exercise to being someone who does exercise. Like there are a bunch of these things that I come with all these identities. That's the nature of human existence. And I'm looking at where do I want to start changing those identities to becoming the person I want to become. And then from that place, there's almost no downside to doing that because you've got an identity that's not serving you, and you're replacing it with an identity that hopefully serves you a little more. The catch is, are you just replacing one entanglement with another? And that second entanglement may have not as immediate negative consequences, but may have sort of similar entanglements in the longer run. And so being very clear on why am I doing this to begin with? What's the real purpose behind it, my wanting to build this habit? And you have to take some time. This goes back to what we do in coaching all the time. Like, what's important about that? And what's important about that? And what's important about that? And really exploring. And that helps to build the reason for the habit to begin with, but also lets you know what should you be cautious about as you go about doing this.
And you might not even discover what you need to be cautious about. But I think we're saying that you need to be cautious no matter what, because in the running example, it's pretty straightforward. I want to be a runner because I want to be healthier. And I might just stop there in terms of my like that seems like a pretty good reason. There's not a lot of danger around that. It's pretty straightforward that, especially if I'm not exercising at all, that running consistently would be a good thing for my life. And so it might actually not be so straightforward what the costs are when we look at our why.
See, these identities are so deep-rooted. Vipin, you mentioned that it's practically right from birth. It is right from birth, actually. Right from birth, the child is the controller and enjoyer. And like, as soon as I cry, I get what I want and everybody's controlled, I enjoy. It is straight from birth. We have the ego straight from birth running the show. To get out of that is so difficult and so absolutely needed for the real self to breathe and for us to have the best experience that we're all longing for all the time. And somewhere along the way, before we arrive at that place of full self-realization, we need habits that get us closer. And if we're not ready to take on the quest of self-realization, which I hope we will get ready for, still having habits like health, are more innocuous. They are getting better. They are getting closer. I'm not a drinker. That's something which is helpful because it is just naturally more aligned with the self, even if that's not the reason I'm doing it. So there is some benefit there. And the more I experience that benefit, hopefully the more receptive I am, the more my consciousness clears, the more I want to get closer to the self. And the more I learn about the self, the more I develop that, as I mentioned in the beginning, that higher taste that sort of transcends all of these other things that are just along the way.
Yeah, what I'm thinking about is there's a very subtle dance where I need to identify enough with this new identity to actually make a change. And yet, if I over identify with it, that is then entangling me in something new.
I'm so glad you just said that, because that was the exact thing that I was grappling with at the moment that I felt inspired to talk about this topic with you guys. Was we do need some identification,
Yes.
but how you find what's enough and then without crossing the line into too much is a tall task.
Well, it's actually layers of identification, right? It's like it's recognizing this identification is temporary that will help me to get to the ultimate, the real thing.
Okay.
Oh my God, it's so I was just gonna say, but the new identity for me is I'm a runner for now. And that exactly what you said about the temporality of what we're talking about. Yeah. I'm using it for a specific purpose.
Right, exactly.
Vipin, you and I were on retreat a couple of weeks ago and in India, and I asked a question to Sachinanda Swami, Hari, your guru, and the person who was running our retreat about some advice for my life. And based on what I had shared, he gave me the very simple but very direct piece of advice to think that I'm nobody special. And it was kind of hard hitting because he called me out for something that I wasn't saying explicitly, but was clearly feeling. And I think with the running example or any of these identities, that can be a helpful framing here of like, I am a runner, but I'm nobody special because I'm a runner. I'm a runner and I'm doing that, and it's for my health, but it doesn't make me so special in any way.
Wonderful. So instead of I'm a runner for now, it's I'm a runner, but I'm not that special. You're not that special, Michael.
Well, it's also with those kinds of things that we don't know. Is the real self a runner like that? Does the real self put on jogging equipment? No, it's not like that. So when there are these things that are clearly demarcated by our stage in life and our connection here in this present situation, then we have temporality attached to it. When it's something that's really core, like self-control or patience or clarity or things like that, then it's not temporal, but it's not for the sake of look at me. It should never be for the sake of look at me. That's purely the ego, right? So that's how we're distinguishing. And for me, I have to walk a very fine line. We always have to walk a fine line, but I'm thinking of one example that is really, really formative for me, which is that ever since I first picked up a crayon in first grade, basically, and I started writing books, I thought, I'm a writer. That's who I am. That's who I'm going to be. I'm going to be like Shakespeare. That name sounds good. And that has followed me to this day, right? And I've had a lot of different phases of relating to that. Pre-monastic journey, I was like, that's what I am. That's like my eternal identity. That's me. I love it. It's great. Once I became a monk, I said, oh, that's going to hold me back. that's going to hold me back. And that is a way of trying to find significance to people and trying to think well of myself and prove myself to myself. It's clear. I see it all. I see it all playing out. I was doing that self work and I was seeing the ego written all over it, of course, because the ego is the default. So if I've not done that work on myself, we have to understand that that's what's running the show. And I decided this is so deep rooted that although I love writing, I don't want to look at myself as a writer. And I took a period of a few years to distance myself from it. And it was one of the most austere things. And it was super helpful. And it doesn't mean that I never wrote, but I never thought of myself as a writer and I didn't have a lot of dedicated time for it. Now, you don't have to do it like that. That's not the formula for disentangling these identities. But that's what I chose to do, which was very helpful for me because I saw how knee deep I was in it. And I needed to know myself apart from that. And I needed to know that when I engage in writing, it's not because I am a writer, but it's because I love to write and I want to offer that as a service to people. And when I came out of that period, I was still a monk. And I said, now I'm ready to embrace this again because I don't have that upadi. I wrote about this in the Suffering That Ends All Suffering reflection on our website. Upadi means designation. It's a mini identity within the ego, as Vipin was talking about. When I can go beyond that upadi or mini identity that I'm a writer, and I can do this purely because I want to serve other people, because I've been given a gift and an inspiration that I can't claim credit for and I can't pat myself on the back for, but I'm so grateful for, then, okay, now let's go. So that's really what we want to encourage is a different relationship with all of these identities. And for each person, that's going to be a journey.
Thank you for that. So in closing, this conversation has been very rich and sort of, it can be confusing for people as to how to know when to use identities to build habits and when not to. So could you each share, what are you taking away from this and what would you want our listeners to take away from this conversation?
For me, just reliving some of this content around James Clear's Atomic Habits is helping me to see a lot of the benefits of taking on identities for the purpose of forming habits. I think there's so much good that when applied with the right mindset and right consciousness that can come out of this. And so I'm not throwing out the baby with the bathwater here at all. And we had talked about this metaphor of walking towards the edge of a cliff before we started recording. And as we've been talking about here, that metaphor has become more and more apparent to me that whenever we're using this methodology of taking on identities and thinking of ourselves as a certain way in order to create certain habits, we just need to be very, very careful. So proceed, but proceed with caution.
Thank you.
It's all about our relationship with our identities. Where is it coming from? Do we understand something about the ego, something about the self? And are we angling towards the self? Is that our motivation? Or are we just feeding ourselves different identities, exchanging them? And they might be more beneficial, they might be less beneficial. More beneficial is good, it's directionally right, but ultimately it's not going to satisfy us. That's what we need to know.
That's great. Thank you so much. I would add two things for myself. One is, Hari, when you were speaking earlier about the identities that are related to the self, and those don't have a temporality to it, you mentioned a series of identities or qualities, and one was patience. And I immediately thought, that's it. That's an identity that I am going to adopt coming out of this conversation, because I think what often I think of myself, especially as it relates to my kids, as an impatient person. And I am going to experiment with taking on this new identity as I am a patient person. And I think that I immediately felt like something shift in me as I thought, of my new identity. I quite like it. And
We're seeing the ego take over.
The caution,
This is
the
a
caution
live
there is,
example.
yeah, it's such a slippery slope again, because I'm a patient person. Yes, everything you said is true. And it's like the same as I'm a humble person. I'm a kind person. I'm so this, I'm so that. When it becomes self-referential, instead of like, this is what I aspire for. I want to serve this quality. I hope and pray that I can become receptive to this quality. I know it's in me because the real self is made of this. Please unearth it. Like, I'm committed. I'm willing to do everything I can. It just has a different flavor.
Yeah. I feel like that's how I was thinking about it.
That is how
it
you were
didn't come
thinking
out.
of it.
It sounds like it didn't come out that way.
People on audio who are listening to the podcast rather than watching it wouldn't have seen your arms go like this. And so that's what I was picking up on when you were doing the little dance that went along with it. But I think what you were saying was that there is a recognition that being patient is a core quality of the self. And because I am a self, I know that that's who I am. And so what I now need to do, and this is a nod to what James Clear is advocating for, is I now need to live into that identity, and I already know that it's in me.
Yeah. Thank you. The second thing I was going to say is that, I mean, this is a point we touched on earlier around association. And Michael, you said this is a whole nother section of James Clear's book about, what does he call it in there?
It's about making my habit as easy to adopt as possible. So making it the lowest barrier to entry. And in order to do that, being around environments and people where the habit becomes socially accepted and socially encouraged and validated.
Yeah. Thank you for reiterating that. So I was going to say, we didn't spend as much time on this idea as I thought we might, but one of the things that I would want to share in closing is I think my own habits, well, I wouldn't even say I know my habits have changed more dramatically over the past 7 years than they have in, I don't know if I could say this categorically, but any other 7-year period prior to that. And that is exclusively due to the association of people in my company right now, and the people, the group of us at Upbuild who have such a strong influence on me and who I aspire to be and who I am becoming. And in ways, some of those things are very explicit habits that I want to develop as a result of that association. But honestly, many of them are happening implicitly. Like, it's not even it's actually habits are changing just through that association without making an explicit identity of it or goal of it. And so just to underscore this point of like who I am spending time with, who I'm around, will change my habits, whether I like it or not. And so be very vigilant about who we surround ourselves with and very intentional about it.
So happy you brought this back, because yes, I also really wanted to drive this home, that actually you are the company that you keep. You're made of the company that you keep. And this is the most important principle in yoga, is sangha, or like-minded connection. And it works the other way as well.
That is a perfect note to end on. I had so much fun in this conversation, and I really appreciated the insights that you both shared. So thank you very, very much.
Feeling is mutual. So grateful. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Vipin. Thank you, Hari.
Thank you for listening to Upbuilding the Self. Upbuild is a leadership development company that offers workshops, coaching, and other services to help you on the path towards being your best self, free from the shackles of the ego. To learn more about our work, visit our website, upbuild.com, and sign up for our newsletter to gain access to podcasts, reflections, and upcoming events. If you enjoyed this episode, please go to iTunes to leave us a review so that others can find and benefit from the podcast. We look forward to being with you again next time.